The gold did not arrive quietly. It announced itself with bells, with shouted prayers, with the groan of ships pressing against wooden docks. Men leaned over railings just to glimpse it. Mothers lifted children onto shoulders so they would remember this moment. Because everyone believed this was what salvation looked like. Crates were opened like relics. Light struck metal, and people gasped as if witnessing a miracle. Gold that had crossed storms, disease, and death. Gold torn from lands most of them would never see. Gold stamped with authority, promise, and fate. In those first moments, no one thought about tomorrow. They thought the metal itself meant security. That weight meant strength. That abundance meant safety. But wealth has a sound when it enters a nation. It drowns out caution. At court, the rooms grew louder. Footsteps echoed on marble floors as messengers rushed between chambers. Orders were written faster than they were understood. Wars that once required hesitation now required only a signature. Why wait when the coffers were full? The king looked at maps not as warnings but invitations. Borders felt temporary. Enemies felt manageable. Gold made distance seem smaller. Risk seemed theoretical. Every campaign was justified by the same quiet belief. There would always be more. In the cities, shopkeepers smiled at first. Coins changed hands more often. Markets bustled. But prices began to rise in ways no one could explain. Not sharply, not suddenly. Just enough to make yesterday feel cheaper than today. Workers were paid the same, but bought less. Bread grew thinner. Oil jars emptied sooner. The gold that promised comfort began to rearrange daily life in subtle, unsettling ways. No one blamed the metal. They blamed bad harvests, greedy merchants, bad luck. Gold never takes responsibility. Silver from distant mountains poured in behind it, tons of it, enough to remake Europe's markets. Enough to distort value itself. Money multiplied faster than goods, and when money grows faster than work, work becomes invisible. Artisans felt it first. Local craftsmen, once respected, found themselves undercut by imported goods paid for with imperial silver. Their hands still knew the craft, but the market no longer cared. A shoemaker watched foreign boots sell cheaper than his own leather. A weaver stared at cloth shipped across seas, its price impossible to match. Skill lost its meaning. Only volume mattered now. Gold rewards speed, not patience. As industry weakened, dependence deepened. Spain began to buy what it once made. And it paid for everything with metal that did not originate from its own soil. The illusion of strength grew thicker. In villages far from ports and palaces, the empire felt distant but demanding. Tax collectors arrived more often. They spoke of duty, of destiny, of empire. They did not speak of inflation. They did not speak of debt. A farmer handed over grain, knowing his own winter would be harder. A widow surrendered coins meant for her children. They were told this was the price of greatness. Gold traveled upward, burden traveled down. At court, conversations shifted from strategy to financing, from alliances to interest. Bankers were invited into rooms once reserved for generals. They did not wear armor. They carried ledgers. Loans arrived wrapped in courtesy and calculation. They promised flexibility. They demanded repayment no matter the outcome of war. Gold did not remove limits. It delayed them. With every shipment, the empire expanded its commitments. More soldiers, more ships, more fronts. War was no longer a reaction. It became a habit. Soldiers left home believing pay would be steady. Many would not see it for months. Some never at all. They marched under banners heavy with symbolism, yet slept hungry. Their boots wore down faster than promises. They fought not only enemies, but arithmetic. An unpaid army is still dangerous, just not always to its enemies. Mutters began. Not rebellion yet, just doubt. In towns, rumors traveled faster than official news. People sensed imbalance even if they lacked language for it. Money felt strange, abundant yet insufficient. Gold flowed through the empire like blood, but it never reached the extremities. At night, candles burned late in administrative offices. Clerks recalculated figures that refused to align. They adjusted assumptions. They postponed realities. Everyone waited for the next fleet, because as long as ships arrived, the story could continue. Gold became the answer to every question. How to fund another war, how to silence unrest, how to postpone reform. No one asked what would happen if the ships were delayed, if storms interfered, if mines yielded less, if creditors lost confidence. The idea felt unthinkable, almost disloyal. An empire cannot admit fragility while still dreaming of expansion. So wealth replaced wisdom quietly, without ceremony. It did not announce its takeover. It simply made caution unnecessary. Decisions once argued were now assumed. Sacrifice was expected from those who never touched the gold itself. And slowly, without noticing the moment it happened, the empire stopped preparing for the future. The war did not feel endless at first. It felt necessary, contained, manageable. Men gathered in town squares, listening to proclamations carried by drums and banners. They were told the fight was far away. They were told it would be brief. They were told victory would protect their homes. Most believed it. They left behind kitchens still warm from morning fires, fields half planted, wives who nodded bravely, hiding fear behind routine, children who did not yet understand what departure meant. The borders of war expanded quietly, like a shadow at dusk. Spain fought not for a single enemy, but for position, for influence, for balance, for promises made years earlier that could not be withdrawn without consequence. Each conflict bled into the next. A war in one region justified another elsewhere. Fronts multiplied faster than victories. Silver paid for it all. Silver extracted by unseen hands. Silver melted into coins that crossed Europe faster than news. As long as silver moved, war moved with it. Soldiers marched across landscapes that did not know their names. Mountains replaced coastlines. Forests replaced villages. Languages shifted. Faces hardened. They fought under flags that meant little to locals and everything to distant courts. For the men on the ground, the reason mattered less than survival. Cold nights, wet powder, rations stretched thin. Pay was promised, then delayed, then explained away. An army can endure hunger, but it remembers it. At campsites, men counted coins they had not received. They bartered boots. They traded favors. They gambled not for profit, but distraction. Letters from home arrived slower. When they came, they spoke of rising prices, of bread that no longer filled the table, of taxes collected with increasing urgency. The war followed them home through ink and paper. Commanders spoke of strategy, but soldiers listened for something else: relief, rotation, an end. None came, because every battle was now tied to credit, and every retreat threatened confidence. To stop fighting would signal weakness, and weakness would close the doors of lenders who had already advanced fortunes on future victories. So the war continued, not because it was winning, but because it could not afford to stop. In palaces, generals waited alongside financiers. Maps lay open next to ledgers. Decisions were made with two questions always present. Can we hold this position? Can we pay for it? Sometimes the answer to only one was enough. Silver kept flowing, not evenly, not fairly. It arrived at ports, then vanished into contracts, wages, repairs, bribes, and interest. What reached the front often arrived late, or damaged, or incomplete. A soldier could win a skirmish and still starve afterward. Mutiny was never announced. It crept in, a refusal to march at dawn, a delay blamed on weather, a sudden disorder that spread too quickly to be coincidence. These were not rebellions against the crown. They were protests against arithmetic. Men fought because peace had become unaffordable. Every month away made return harder. Land went untended. Families borrowed to survive. Debts accumulated quietly, mirroring the empire's own. The war consumed futures before it consumed lives. Civilians in occupied regions suffered differently. Their harvests were seized, their homes repurposed, their sons conscripted by forces that spoke unfamiliar tongues. They learned quickly that war did not require hatred to be devastating, only logistics. Silver purchased obedience where loyalty did not exist. Mercenaries filled gaps where ideology failed. They fought for coin, and when the coin stopped, they fought for themselves. The lines between ally, enemy, and opportunist blurred. Violence followed supply routes, not morals. In distant villages of Spain, the war was felt through absence, men gone for years, some never returning. Others returning altered. A boy became head of household without realizing it. A woman learned to negotiate taxes alone. A family adjusted to less, then less again. War reshaped society quietly, one empty chair at a time. The empire still appeared powerful. Its banners still waved. Its armies still moved. But the machinery beneath strained. Silver shipments were no longer a blessing. They were deadlines. Each arrival was already spent, already owed, already anticipated by creditors who watched closely for any sign of hesitation. War had become a performance for financial audiences. A lost battle mattered less than a delayed payment. A held position mattered more than the lives required to keep it. Men sensed this shift even if they could not articulate it. They felt expendable, replaceable, accounted for. They fought on because retreat offered no safety, only disgrace, only debt. Peace would mean unpaid wages, landlords demanding rent. A life resumed with nothing saved, so they marched again. Across rivers that froze at night, across plains stripped bare by earlier armies, through towns that closed their gates not out of loyalty, but fear. The war stretched across years, then decades. It outlived kings. It outlived reasons. It became a condition rather than an event. Silver continued to fund movement without direction. It enabled action without resolution. An empire at war everywhere is an empire at rest nowhere. And as borders blurred, so did responsibility. Losses were attributed to distance, failures to miscommunication. No one admitted exhaustion, because to admit it would collapse the structure holding the war together. So the fighting persisted, not driven by triumph, but by the impossibility of stopping. An empire cannot admit fragility while still dreaming of expansion. So wealth replaced wisdom quietly, without ceremony. It did not announce its takeover. It simply made caution unnecessary. Decisions once argued were now assumed. Sacrifice was expected from those who never touched the gold itself. And slowly, without noticing the moment it happened, the empire stopped preparing for the future. Behind the stone walls of power, war sounded different. No drums, no cannon fire, only murmurs. Paper sliding across tables, ink drying before doubt could catch it. Rooms lit by candles stayed awake long after cities slept. Maps lay open, not marked with blood, but with costs. Distances were measured in days of marching and years of repayment. Gold sat heavy in chests nearby, yet everyone knew it was already gone. The men who gathered here did not wear armor. Their hands were clean, their voices low. They spoke of campaigns as obligations, not ambitions. A fortress was no longer a symbol. It was an expense. A fleet was not power. It was maintenance. Each decision carried a price that extended beyond the present moment. Bankers entered quietly. They bowed. They smiled. They listened more than they spoke. Their ledgers held more authority than banners outside. They did not need to threaten. Numbers did the work for them. Loans were framed as partnerships, as trust, as belief in the empire's future. Interest was mentioned almost casually, as if it were weather. Unavoidable, impersonal. But everyone in the room understood the truth. This was war by other means. The crown needed funds before it needed victories. Soldiers could wait. Credit could not. Silver from overseas was pledged before it was mined. Future shipments promised to cover present desperation. Tomorrow was mortgaged to keep today alive. No one said the word bankruptcy aloud. It hovered in the air, unspoken, heavy. Each loan postponed collapse while tightening its grip. Behind closed doors, morality bent. Alliances shifted not by loyalty, but by rates. A campaign was approved not because it was wise, but because it justified another advance. Maps were redrawn to reassure creditors. Borders mattered less than confidence. If belief held, money flowed. If belief wavered, everything froze. So belief was protected at all costs. Bad news was softened. Defeats were reframed as strategic withdrawals. Delays were blamed on weather, never weakness. Truth became a liability. Messengers waited outside chambers, holding reports they were not yet allowed to deliver. Lives lost became footnotes until accounts were balanced. The distance between battlefield and balance sheet grew wider. A soldier freezing at night never knew his fate was being debated over wine. A widow mourning at dawn never knew her husband's death had already been factored into projections. The empire functioned on abstraction. Debt made time behave strangely. Immediate suffering was ignored in favor of long-term obligation. But long-term obligation eventually becomes immediate. Creditors began to ask sharper questions, not about honor, about security, what collateral remained, what territories could be guaranteed, what revenues were reliable. Land became leverage. People became reassurance. The empire's future was discussed in pieces. Officials nodded, agreed, compromised. They reassured lenders that order would hold. that taxation would increase, that resistance would be managed. Behind the calm, pressure mounted. Taxation was not policy, it was necessity. Collectors were instructed to be firm, not cruel, just persistent. Villages felt the difference immediately. What had once been contribution became extraction. What had once been sacrifice became survival. In court, this was described as efficiency. Gold still arrived, but it vanished faster now, straight from dock to debt, never touching the people who were told it represented their prosperity. The illusion remained intact only at the surface. Bankers gained access, then influence, then patience wore thin. They did not need to shout, silence was enough. A delayed shipment triggered letters, then visits, then adjustments. Military plans shifted to appease markets. Garrisons were held not because they were vital, but because abandoning them would signal weakness. Human lives stabilized reputations. In these rooms, responsibility was diluted. No one man decided everything. Each decision passed through layers of justification. This made guilt manageable. When someone questioned the cost, the answer was always the same. There is no alternative. Debt narrowed imagination. It turned choice into illusion. A commander's request for reinforcements was weighed against interest payments. A plea for relief was compared to contractual deadlines. Empathy competed with arithmetic. Arithmetic always won. At night, some officials stared at ceilings, listening to the distant city breathe. They knew the empire was stretched. They knew the math no longer favored hope. But admitting it would end everything, so they continued. Loans were renewed, terms adjusted, confidence maintained. The war machine moved forward, not because it was strong, but because stopping it would expose fragility. Credit had become the spine of empire. Brittle, unforgiving. Every victory bought time. Every loss consumed it. Behind closed doors, the true battlefield was not Europe or the seas. It was trust. And trust, once strained, never fully recovers. Whispers grew louder, conditions tightened, margins disappeared. The empire stood, supported by paper and promise, while beneath it, the foundation quietly shifted. An empire cannot admit fragility while still dreaming of expansion, so wealth replaced wisdom quietly, without ceremony. It did not announce its takeover. It simply made caution unnecessary. Decisions once argued were now assumed. Sacrifice was expected from those who never touched the gold itself. And slowly, without noticing the moment it happened, the empire stopped preparing for the future. The cost did not arrive all at once. It seeped in. At first it was a pause in the market, a hesitation before coins changed hands, a glance exchanged between buyer and seller, both sensing something had shifted. Bread still baked in the mornings. But the loaves were smaller, flour stretched thinner. The price written on the board no longer felt stable. People began to count differently. Mothers memorized numbers without realizing it. How many meals from one sack? How many days before the next tax visit? How long a candle must last if burned only at night? Inflation did not announce itself. It whispered. Wages arrived on time, then late. Then they arrived unchanged while everything else moved ahead of them. A man could work the same hours, sweat the same sweat, and return home with less each week. No one explained why. There were no proclamations for this kind of loss. In the streets, conversations lowered in volume. Complaints were shared quietly, as if being overheard could make things worse. The gold everyone had heard about never passed through these hands. Taxes followed inflation like a shadow. Assessments revised, collections increased, exemptions vanished. Officials spoke politely, firmly. They carried lists, not weapons. Refusal was not an option. Delay was rarely forgiven. A farmer watched grain leave his barn, knowing winter would come regardless of empire. A merchant handed over profits already eroded by rising costs. A widow surrendered the last coins hidden beneath floorboards. Each payment felt final. Rationing crept into daily routine, not imposed by decree at first, but by necessity. Meals simplified. Meat became rare, oil precious, cloth reused until it thinned to memory. Children learned hunger early, not starvation, something quieter, a constant absence that taught patience too young. Labor changed meaning. Men worked longer for the same return. Women took on tasks once shared. Children filled gaps wherever they could. Time lost its rhythm. Days blended together under strain. Festivals faded. Celebrations shortened. Joy became conditional. The empire still demanded output. Fields tilled. Roads maintained. Ships repaired. Work did not stop because the war did not stop. Those who could leave did. They moved toward cities, ports, anywhere rumor suggested opportunity. Often they found only more competition. Crowded rooms replaced open land. Disease followed density, another invisible cost. In these places, news traveled faster. Stories of battles lost or won mattered less than the price of grain that morning. People measured the war, not in victories, but in affordability. Families waited for letters that never arrived, not knowing whether silence meant delay, desertion, or death. Each knock at the door carried weight. Grief became familiar. So did uncertainty. Some soldiers returned home changed, carrying injuries that never healed. They found prices unrecognizable, savings meaningless. A lifetime of work undone by numbers they did not control. Inflation erased memory. What once cost a coin now required two. What once required two now required five. People spoke of the past as if it were another country, a place where effort still translated into security. Trust eroded quietly. Neighbors borrowed from neighbors, then stopped. Credit at the personal level collapsed before the empires ever did. Promises lost value faster than currency. Children were sent to work earlier. Education became a luxury. Dreams narrowed. A generation learned to survive before it learned to hope. In some towns, resentment grew. Not loud, not organized. Just a sense of imbalance, of carrying weight without seeing purpose. They were told the empire was strong. They were told sacrifices mattered, but strength felt distant, abstract. What mattered was tomorrow's meal. Black markets emerged without ceremony, not criminal intent, just adaptation. Rules bent under pressure, morality adjusted to hunger. Authorities responded unevenly, sometimes harshly, sometimes by looking away. Control cost money, too. The gap between official narratives and lived reality widened. People learned to listen selectively. They did not rebel. They endured. Endurance became the defining act. In cities, beggars multiplied, not the idle, the displaced, former craftsmen, former soldiers, former farmers. Each carried a story that sounded the same after a while. Work disappeared, prices rose, debt remained, churches filled not only with prayer but with quiet negotiation, food distribution, shelter arrangements, unspoken triage. Charity tried to keep pace with need and failed. Children grew accustomed to watching adults worry, to hearing conversations stop when they entered a room. They learned that the future was something fragile. The war felt present even without armies nearby. It lived in cupboards, in ledgers, in exhausted faces. People did not curse gold. They barely thought of it. They cursed absence, uncertainty, the feeling of being spent. As years passed, survival strategies hardened into habits. Rationing became culture. Scarcity normalized. Hope adjusted downward. The empire continued to function because people absorbed the shock silently. They adjusted. They endured. They paid. And with every adjustment, the cost moved further away from the battlefield and deeper into ordinary lives. The word spread quietly at first, not through proclamations, through hesitation, payments delayed, suppliers waiting longer than promised, letters unanswered. The crown did not announce failure. It adjusted language, restructured obligations, renegotiated terms. Bankruptcy was never spoken aloud. It was implied. In council chambers, voices softened. Confidence became performance. Smiles concealed arithmetic that no longer worked. What had once been temporary shortfall hardened into pattern. Creditors noticed. They had been patient. They had believed in the empire's reach, its reputation, its inevitability. Now they began to protect themselves. Interest climbed. Conditions tightened. Flexibility vanished. Loans once extended on faith now demanded guarantees. Land, revenue streams, future taxes. The empire offered what it could not easily spare. Promises stacked upon promises. Each agreement solved today by worsening tomorrow. Officials spoke of recovery, of reorganization, of resilience. But behind closed doors, they counted differently now. Not growth, survival. Military victories no longer inspired confidence. They raised questions. How much did this cost? How long before the next payment? A captured city meant garrison expenses. A defended border meant continuous supply. Holding territory became more expensive than losing it. The idea of retreat surfaced quietly, then vanished. Retreat would be interpreted as weakness. Weakness would collapse credit. So they held positions that drained resources faster than enemies ever could. Soldiers sensed the shift. Pay arrived in fragments. Supplies rationed, equipment reused beyond reason. Orders still came, but urgency replaced clarity. They were told to endure. Again. Mutiny was punished swiftly now, not out of fear of rebellion, but fear of signal. Any sign of internal fracture could ripple outward. Discipline became financial policy. At home, people felt the change without understanding its source. Public works slowed. Maintenance deferred. Support vanished. The state withdrew in subtle ways. Roads went unrepaired. Ports understaffed. Relief inconsistent. Presence faded. Confidence is expensive to maintain. The crown still held ceremonies, still spoke of continuity. But the rhythm had changed. Officials rotated faster. Responsibility diffused. No one wanted to be associated with decisions that no longer had solutions. The machinery of governance continued to move, but with friction. Bankruptcies returned like echoes. Not once, again, and again. Each declaration framed as exceptional. Each one eroded trust further. Creditors recalculated risk with increasing realism. Spain was no longer an unstoppable force. It was a complicated account. Foreign powers noticed. They adjusted their posture. Less deference, more testing. Alliances grew conditional. Respect grew thinner. An empire that cannot pay cannot command indefinitely. The illusion persisted longest at the top. Palaces remained intact. Ceremonies precise. Rituals unbroken. But beneath the surface, promises expired. Soldiers returning home found recognition delayed. Pensions reduced. Compensation questioned. Service became a burden rather than honor. Families who had sacrificed for decades received little in return. Silence replaced celebration. Markets reacted before people did. Confidence slipped. Trade adjusted. Foreign merchants demanded higher premiums. Local traders hesitated. Money slowed. In villages, people stopped expecting help. They relied on community, on memory. The empire's voice grew distant. Where once authority felt immediate, now it felt abstract. Laws existed, but enforcement wavered. Order became uneven. This was not collapse's spectacle. No walls falling, no capitals burning. This was erosion, slow, administrative, relentless. Each year, the margin for error narrowed. Every crisis consumed reserves that no longer existed. Decisions were postponed until postponement became the decision. Leadership spoke of reform. But reform requires resources, and resources were already spoken for. Generations had been financed forward. The future arrived already indebted. Younger officials entered service knowing limits they were never allowed to name. They inherited systems optimized for expansion, now forced to manage contraction. The tools did not fit the task. Confidence was replaced by caution, caution by paralysis. An empire built on momentum struggled to stand still. People adjusted expectations downward. They no longer asked when prosperity would return. They asked how long stability could last. Hope changed shape. In public, loyalty remained. In private, resignation settled. Not rebellion, acceptance. The empire continued because systems tend to persist longer than belief. But belief had been the fuel, and now it burned thin. Every unpaid promise left a mark. Every delayed wage rewrote loyalty. Every renegotiated debt shifted power. What remained was structure without certainty, authority without confidence, and an empire learning, too late, that strength measured only in gold cannot survive when the gold no longer convinces. They learned that the future was something fragile. The war felt present even without armies nearby. It lived in cupboards, in ledgers, in exhausted faces. People did not curse gold. They barely thought of it. They cursed absence, uncertainty, the feeling of being spent. As years passed, survival strategies hardened into habits. Rationing became culture. Scarcity normalized. Hope adjusted downward. The empire continued to function because people absorbed the shock silently. They adjusted. They endured. They paid. And with every adjustment, the cost moved further away from the battlefield and deeper into ordinary lives. The gold remained long after the shouting stopped, long after banners faded, long after names carved in stone lost their meaning. It sat in vaults, in coins, in memory. But the empire it once sustained existed now as habit, not force. People still spoke its language, still followed its rituals, still carried its weight in how they moved through the world. Yet something essential had shifted. The future no longer felt owned. It felt negotiated. Children grew up hearing stories of greatness they could not reconcile with their present. They were told of fleets that ruled oceans, of armies that shaped continents. But their streets were quiet, their opportunities narrow. They inherited reverence without reward. Institutions persisted out of momentum. Courts convened, bureaucracies processed, orders issued, but initiative slowed. The empire had learned caution too late. Gold had taught it to postpone decisions, to solve problems with payment instead of change, to expand without strengthening. Those habits did not vanish when wealth thinned. They hardened. Reform became risky, innovation suspicious. Why alter systems that once worked even if they no longer did? History weighed heavily on every choice. Officials compared present challenges to past triumphs. They sought reassurance in memory, but memory does not generate resources. The world beyond Spain adjusted faster. Other powers learned from its example. They diversified. They invested differently. They saw that endless extraction weakens what it enriches. Spain carried the lesson internally. It surfaced in cautionary whispers, in reforms proposed, then softened, in ambitions scaled back before they could disappoint. The empire no longer chased everything, but it still carried obligations designed for dominance. Territories once held for prestige became burdens. Maintaining them drained energy needed elsewhere. Letting go felt like betrayal, so the weight remained. Civilians adapted. They measured success in stability, not growth. They prized predictability. Risk felt dangerous now. Generations had watched fortune arrive and destroy balance. They learned restraint instinctively. Gold had once been a promise. Now it was a warning. Writers hinted at it. Artists framed it without naming it. Economists argued around it. The idea that abundance can hollow a nation if it replaces work, that money without foundation corrodes judgment, that power borrowed from resources must be repaid in resilience. These lessons did not arrive as declarations. They filtered slowly through experience. Spain did not vanish. It endured. But endurance is not the same as influence. The empire's shadow remained longer than its reach. People still believed in order, in tradition, in continuity, but the certainty that once drove expansion never returned. Gold had altered time. It had pulled the future forward, spent it, and left the present to manage consequences. Every generation afterward felt this distortion. Plans shortened, expectations narrowed, ambition learned restraint. The empire became a reference rather than a force, a memory rather than a direction. And memory is selective. It remembers victories more easily than costs, glory more than inflation, expansion more than erosion. But beneath the stories, the structure remained altered. The lesson was embedded in systems, in budgets cautious by design, in institutions wary of excess. Gold had not disappeared. It had been absorbed into identity. Spain carried its wealth as history, not momentum. The empire's end was not marked by surrender. It was marked by adjustment, by learning to exist without illusion, by learning that survival requires balance more than abundance. The sound of arriving ships no longer stirred crowds. Coins no longer defined destiny. What remained was a quieter understanding that wealth can buy time, but time demands wisdom, and wisdom once ignored leaves traces that last far longer than gold ever could. They learned that the future was something fragile. The war felt present even without armies nearby. It lived in cupboards, in ledgers, in exhausted faces. People did not curse gold. They barely thought of it. They cursed absence, uncertainty, the feeling of being spent. As years passed, survival strategies hardened into habits. Rationing became culture. Scarcity normalized. Hope adjusted downward. The empire continued to function because people absorbed the shock silently. They adjusted. They endured. They paid. And with every adjustment, the cost moved further away from the battlefield and deeper into ordinary lives.